as director of the task force responsible for establishing a Canadian Center to better support global democracy and good governance. It's a mandate letter platform commitment announced by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at December 2021 Summit for Democracy. Prior to this role, Ms. Malette was the Director of Strategic Issues in the Intergovernmental Affairs Secretariat of the Privy Council Office. In this role, she supported the Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs in their engagement with the province and territories, and helped to deliver on the government's key mandate commitments in areas of COVID response, health, climate, and reconciliation. Previously, Ayesha also led the whole of government effort to prevent the counter foreign interferences in Canada's democratic institutions and the 2019 general election. She has also worked at the International Affairs Division of Public Safety and Public Safety Canada, where she led the coordination of the department's multilateral engagement with the United Nations and the Organization of American States on policy issues related to human rights, law enforcement, counterterrorism, border security, and corrections. Academically, she has specialized in international relations as well as in public administration. She also sits on the board of directors of several key organizations. Without further ado, I'll now pass on the microphone to Madame Malette. Ayesha, the microphone is yours.
Merci, Hamid. Thank you so much. That was a long introduction, and I'm grateful for your kind words and honored to be at the helm of the Canadian International Council as we launch another year of important foreign policy dialogues within our Ottawa community and, of course, across Canada. Let me start by saying congratulations to you, Hamid, and of course, to Reid, our fearless tech support for launching another excellent session and a year of the Middle East Study Group. Your leadership at the helm of this organization has meant so much. And I look forward to another really fascinating discussion tonight with our honored guest, Dr. Glenn E. Robinson. Dr. Robinson is an acclaimed and distinguished author, an academic expert on a host of issues, recently retired with our congratulations from a full professorship at the of defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School, and has won numerous awards and accolades, both at the Naval Postgraduate School as well as at UC Berkeley. I would say that he is here in part to speak about a very well-received book that has won awards both in foreign policy, the 2021 Best Book of the Year by Foreign Policy, as well as 2021's Best Book of the Year on the Middle East category by Foreign Affairs. But more broadly, just to speak about really important challenges with respect to global jihad, 4 different waves of jihad, and I won't steal his thunder, but we're excited to have you here and look forward to a really interesting and fascinating discussion with you. And so with that, Dr. Robinson, I will hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And la parole est à vous. Merci.
Ayesha, thank you very much for that overly kind introduction. And Hamid, thank you for the invitation and your persistence, which is very much appreciated. So it's a great honor to be here with the Canadian International Council. And as Ayesha said, what I'm going to do is present some of the main arguments in this book that was just published last year with the Stanford University Press on global jihad, some of the kind of the big arguments, the big issues, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So I'm going to do a screen share right now. So got a few slides. And I will go through them quite quickly in order to, in about 20 minutes or so, in order to get to discussion. But I do want to really present sort of the big picture arguments that I make in this book. As Ayesha said, I just retired last month from the Naval Postgraduate School, so I'm definitely not representing anybody's views except for my own. That would always be true anyway, but I'm not sure I have to still say that being retired, but I will anyway. All right. So in this book, I make two broad arguments. The primary argument, as Ayesha hinted at, is to try and understand this phenomenon of global jihad that we've seen over the last 4 decades. This is not an ancient tradition or phenomenon. And how to understand, how do we make sense of this phenomenon that we've seen? And I argue that there have been very distinct iterations or waves, and in fact, 4 very distinct iterations or waves of global jihad since the 1980s. Distinct in terms of the crises that launched them, distinct in terms of the sort of the broader problem that they identify, distinct in terms of the ideological formulations. Now, they all are under the umbrella of global jihad, so they're all fit into this phenomenon, but quite distinctive within those bounds. So that's the primary purpose of the book and what I'll be spending the most time on here. And towards the end of the book and towards the end of my remarks today, I asked the so what question. I mean, where does this phenomenon fit into the broader universe of violent political, primarily non-state movements over the last century or so? And here I make a provocative argument, drawing on some of the work that Ken Jowett did in the 1990s, which I sort of updated and changed and fiddled with, and I think make it a bit more useful in today's world. That there's a distinctive subset of violent political groups, we call movements of rage, and they share 2 distinctive variables, 2 distinctive characteristics, if you will. One is calls for an implementation of nihilistic violence. Nihilism here in the political sense, not the philosophical sense. We can talk more about that. And sharing apocalyptic ideologies, end times, end of the world. And this applies to both religious and non-religious groups that basically are making arguments of massive bloodshed in the near term, but some kind of a nirvana or just better society just around the corner, but we're going to have to go through significant upheaval and turmoil and violence and bloodshed in order to get there. So looking at through those 2 variables, you now allows us to see this phenomenon, I think, in very interesting ways, and not just as sui generis, unique to itself, but actually sharing some really important characteristics to very different kinds of political movements. Not a lot, but a important handful around the world. So that's where we're going, and I'll just go very quickly through each of these 4 waves. Of course, global jihad does not come out of the thin blue sky. There's a background to it. So I do have an introductory chapter that talks about the rise of political Islam or Islamism in the 20th century, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and similar kinds of groups being represented of it. Hassan al-Banna, whose picture you see at the top of your screen, is the founder of he's an Egyptian school teacher, founded the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, in Egypt in 1920. And the point that I want to leave you with on that is Islamism is primarily non-violent and has been from its origin. It doesn't mean it has not engaged in violence, but political violence is not central to its political project. In general, again, it has engaged in violence from time to time. I don't want to, make light of that, but it's not foundational to what it wants to do. In part because of I argue, the failure of Islamism to really change things on the ground. In the 1960s, early 70s, you had an intellectual architecture created around the concept of jihadism. And the main difference between Islamism and jihadism revolves around the issue of violence. Jihadis, including a couple of people you see on your screen here, Ayatollah Khomeini and Sayyid Qutb from the Shia and the Sunni worlds, respectively, who are writing almost the same time from the mid-60s to 1970, make the case essentially that the political system is rigged, it's blocked, only real change can come from direct action. And they essentially called for political violence under the banner of Islam, either explicitly or more implicitly, depending on the ideologue. And these aren't the only 2. There's a number of ideologues. Right. that were writing in a similar vein. And then in the 1980s, you have this offshoot of jihadism. It accepts the arguments about violence, but makes the argument that the problem is not some local apostate leader, it's not some patch of land that's occupied by a neighboring country, but it's systemic, it's globally systemic. And you had, as I argue in the book, 4 fairly distinctive iterations of this globally systemic problem that the Muslim world must confront, and must confront with violence. And so let's go through that. The first wave I talk about begins with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as so many things do. Over the course of the 1980s, you had, of course, the specific argument about the problem that we face is the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the need to liberate Afghanistan. But there were some ideologues, primarily this man in front of you, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, Imam al-Jihad, the preacher of jihad. He was the most famous of these ideologues of the time that said, you know, what we're seeing in Afghanistan is not unique. We see this, the occupation of Muslim lands by foreign infidel powers, you know, in a dozen other places around the world, in the Central Asian republics that at the time were ruled by Moscow, you know, in Kashmir and northern India and Mindanao and the southern Philippines and elsewhere. And so we need to devise a strategy to liberate all of these occupied Muslim lands and not just stop at Afghanistan. So his strategy is, and I'm going to focus here on point number 2 on your screen. What I don't translate it, but it's a sort of an encapsulation of the idea I term the Jihad International. It comes from the Arabic Al-Qaeda Sulba. And essentially what this is the creation of a pious warrior class that would travel the world, work with local Muslim communities to liberate their lands from some foreign occupying infidel power. Now, what was interesting about this, he writes this, I mean, in the 1980s, the phrase Al-Qaeda Sulba, the solid base or the solid foundation, was very commonly used. And it was meant by everybody, including Azzam early on, to mean territory, the creation of a solid base or a solid foundation of territory from which you can go out into the world and to do various things depending on the ideologue. In the last 2 years of his life, Azzam started to reinterpret that, and in particular in the April 1988 issue of the journal that you see in front of you, Malette Jihad, to mean not a territory, but again, this sort of pious class of warriors, of Muslim warriors that would help liberate occupied lands. So no longer to mean Afghanistan essentially, but again, this pious class. In other words, it was the same idea of the Communist International back in the 19-teens, 1920s, even 1930s, before Stalin got rid of it, which was the creation of essentially a war, not a pious, but a communist warrior class that would assist local communities throughout Europe, perhaps even beyond, but primarily in Europe, to overthrow bourgeois repression wherever they found it, to help local communities overthrow bourgeois repression. So this Jihadi International is very much the same thing as a Communist International, but obviously under the banner of Islam instead of under the banner of communism. So this was the very first vision of what a global jihad should look like, how it should be implemented on the global systemic problem of occupied Muslim lands across most of the world, frankly, not the Western Hemisphere, but in the rest of the world. This first wave dies in 1989-90. Why? Azzam was assassinated in 1989 by unknown suspects, and in 1990, his idea was put to the test, and that is after the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. As I think all of you probably know, bin Laden approached the Saudi royal family and said, don't bring in the Americans and other infidels. let's do the Jihadi International. Let's do Azam's model and apply it to Kuwait. We'll liberate liberate Kuwait against Iraqi forces that way. The Saudis rejected that notion, which was a stepping stone in the radicalization of bin Laden himself. Anyway, lots more interesting things with Azam. There's a new biography out by my friend Thomas Heckhammer, which I heartily recommend on Azam. The short version is in my book, but again, you got 750 pages of outstanding biography. Azam was very much an ideas man. He's very interesting amongst the jihadi ideologues that one finds. All right, let's move on to the second wave, which is the one that certainly folks in North America are perhaps most familiar with, and that is of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Now, the crisis that launches this second wave in the mid-90s is the defeat of jihadi movements in a number of places, but most importantly, Egypt and Algeria. By the mid-90s, by 1995, it was very clear that these groups that people thought were probably going to take power, by the mid-90s, they had been essentially defeated. By 1997, in both those cases, it was formalized, the victory of the state over these groups. And at the same time, in the 1990s, following that first Gulf War, you saw the expansion of the American military footprint throughout the Middle East, on the Arabian Peninsula in particular. And bin Laden linked those two things together to basically describe this larger problem, and that is the durability of apostate regimes. How is it that regimes in Egypt and in Algeria and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that he viewed as apostate, how can they stay in power? And to explain that, he takes this idea from the man that you see in front of you, this is Mohammed Abdeslam Faraj, or Farag for Egyptian speakers, that in the late 70s, he wrote this short book, again, you see in front of you, Al-Farida Al-Ghaiba, the hidden duty or the absent obligation, by which he meant armed jihad. And Faraj comes up with this dichotomy of near enemy, far enemy, right? This is not some old theological concept. It was created in the late 1970s. By Faraj. And he does so in order to warn his followers not to attack the far enemy, which for him was Israel, not the United States, and instead focus attention and resources on the near enemy, the Egyptian regime. Bin Laden did several interesting things, but the most interesting thing he did conceptually was to take this concept and said, Faraj had it right in terms of a good concept, kind of a useful concept to understand center-periphery relations between Washington and Cairo and elsewhere. But he had the prioritization wrong. And according to bin Laden, you have to go after America first. You have to drive the Americans out of the region. And once you do that, then these local, again, apostate regimes will become vulnerable and subject to overthrow in a way that you just can't do with the Americans there always backing them up. The Americans and their allies, but primarily the Americans. So bin Laden then launches this second wave that is focused on America first, on driving the Americans out of the Middle East, beginning with the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, broader Muslim world eventually, in order to weaken local apostate regimes that then can be overthrown by bin Laden and his followers. Now, this second wave essentially it has its heyday from 1998 with the embassy bombings in East Africa through 9/11, of course. By 2003, it's mostly Al-Qaeda Central, as it came to be known, was mostly gone. I date its end to 2011 when bin Laden himself was killed by US Navy SEALs in Pakistan. That doesn't mean to say that there are not a few believers in this second phase ideology, just like there are a few believers in that first wave of liberating occupied lands, but they don't drive the train at this point. Those sails belong elsewhere. All right, so the third wave is the ISIS wave, again, quite well known to most North Americans, especially an audience like this. The Caliphate wave, this is the state building wave. So again, not about liberating occupied territories, not about driving the Americans out of the region to make vulnerable these local apostate regimes. This is about state building, and state building in the heart of the Middle East. Excuse me. It's driven, again, specific crises quite different from the first two waves. In this case, the destruction of the Iraqi state by the US invasion in 2003 didn't go very well in those early years, but the Syrian civil war in 2011 gave these folks a sort of a fresh start. The argument both amongst Sunni jihadis in both Syria and Iraq was similar, and that is their countries were ruled by heretical regimes, Shia-based regimes in Baghdad and Damascus, Baghdad recently, since 2003, and its aftermath, and of course in Syria since the 1960s, and the Ba'athist coup and its aftermath brought the Shia, essentially the Alawis, which is Shia subset, into power into Damascus. Now, this is the largest of the four waves. And so here I have a half a dozen bullet points of ideological innovations. I'll just mention a couple in passing. The big picture one is, again, its raison d'etre is a state building enterprise, but not any old state. ISIS was building a pre-Westphalian state. Similar to European states prior to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Before the Treaty of Westphalia, just to oversimplify, and this was primarily between smaller Germanic states, states would view only their own state as legitimate. Every other state was illegitimate in the eyes of God. And in 1648, they basically agreed, now let's get rid of that paradigm and we'll accept everybody's basic legitimacy. Doesn't mean we won't wage war on you, but it's not because you're an affront to God, it's for some other reason. For ISIS, it was very much a pre-Westphalian state. It was the only legitimate state in the world. All other states were an affront to God. And this is why ISIS made really never tried to have diplomatic relations with Canada or anybody else, never tried to get a seat at the United Nations. They were not interested in the Westphalian system of states that we have in the world today. Again, they were very much pre-Westphalian. So a number of other kind of interesting, if often gory, characteristics of ISIS: the apocalyptic nature of its ideology, which I cover, but it's been covered in detail by a couple of my colleagues. Even more so, the extreme sectarianism, the violence, the management or administration of savagery, of savage violence, and the role that plays. We can again talk more about that if you'd like. And then I talked about something that doesn't get covered nearly enough, and that is what I call jihadi cool, and the appeal of ISIS through this notion of jihadi cool, what anarchists in the 19th and early 20th century would refer to as propaganda of the deed. And it's just one of those interesting things that ISIS ideologues spent very little time, not zero time, but very little time trying to convince and engage in debate with the high-ranking clerics, the ulama, in the Muslim world about the rightness of their cause, the sort of theological justifications that could be convincing to experts in the field. And instead, they wanted to recruit young men looking for adventure and excitement and meaning in their lives to come fight for them. And so the sort of performative, savage violence that you see. Here's the Jordanian pilot you're all familiar with, about to be burned to death, all televised, uploaded on the internet, distributed in social media, etc. This was not a coincidence. This was a major part of how ISIS recruited people and sort of, kept people in that stream coming to ISIS, both Arab men in the region, but Muslims from Europe, from North America, from the Caucasus, and elsewhere. And part of that jihadi cool, and again, this I don't think gets studied enough, is the promise of essentially unlimited sex to these young men that would come and fight for them, either legitimate brides, trying to attract young women to come from various places to marry ISIS fighters, to sex slaves amongst the Yazidi or the Zoroastrians of Iraq, etc. So this is part of the appeal, that jihadi cool. You can live this super cool life doing things that you could never do in Ottawa, but you can do it here and be rewarded for it. In the book. And finally, the fourth wave, that the current wave that we're in, I think the third wave essentially ends with the destruction of the territorial state in 2017. Doesn't mean ISIS has gone away. We know it remains a formidable jihadi, guerrilla group or terror group, whatever you want to call it. But it's not a state. It doesn't control territory in the way that it used to. The fourth wave begins almost at the same time as the third wave, but for different reasons. This has to do with the destruction of the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in 2001, and then later on the destruction of the so-called Caliphate in 2017. The broader problem or crisis that was looming was the defeat, or the looming defeat, of global jihad itself. So this man took it upon himself. This is Abu Musab al-Suri, a Syrian from the Aleppo region, very much involved in the first round of civil war in Syria in the early 80s, a prolific writer, spent a lot of time in Europe and Spain and London in particular. And he writes this internet book. You see the cover in front of you, Da'wat al-Muqawwama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, the call for global Islamic resistance. And this is this fourth wave of global jihad, in which the notion is we need to get away. We global jihadis need to get away from organizations, and we need to create a system that can survive this very weak period that we're currently in. He uses the phrase in Arabic, Nizam la Tanzim. Nizam, system, La Tanzim, not organization. It's kind of a play on words in Arabic because both words come from the same root, as you could probably tell. So how do you create a system and not an organization? This idea has come into English as leaderless jihad through Mark Sageman and others, which is an okay translation. It's the phrase in Arabic is jihad fardi, which means personal jihad. In other words, lone wolf attacks or small group attacks of networked, connected individuals and small groups who are not tied to a particular individual or organization, but are linked through modern information technologies. And so this is the sort of the key concept. And I just want to make one last point, and then I'll do the so what for a couple minutes and close it down here. This is a form of what is increasingly called stochastic terror or stochastic violence, stochastic being a form of probability or term of probability. But this is inspired violence, violence that is autonomously undertaken by an individual or a small group that is linked, but only ideologically linked, not in any tangible way, to some leader, some group out there in the world. Who calls for violence, and somebody will take up the torch to implement it. The problem is, so you can stochastic, the rise in probability. You know there's going to be an increase in violence after such a call goes out. You just don't know who is going to be motivated enough that week or that month to implement the violence. So this is the hallmark of this fourth wave of global jihad. It's also the hallmark of white nationalism. You see this, in fact, it was two members of the KKK, one of whom recently died in Fallbrook, California, outside of San Diego, who first in the 1990s came up with this idea of what we now know as stochastic violence or stochastic terror, of how to get the message out, how to inspire people to act violently, but do it in a way where you have plausible deniability, that you yourself are not convicted of. So people have been thinking about this idea for 3 decades now, and the global jihadis have certainly linked on to it. All right, so last thing, how do we think about this movement more broadly? Where does it fit into the larger universe of violent non-state political movements over the last century? And just very briefly, I make the case in the book that virtually all forms of political violence, again, non-state political violence done in the last century, have been under the banner of Enlightenment ideals, of forward progress. And I make the case, even with fascism, elements of fascism, that talk about the material modernization, and we can talk more about that if you want. Here's Mussolini in tearing down one of the neighborhoods of Rome to build broad boulevards and monuments and what have you. Many of you have probably been to this neighborhood if you've ever been to St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. So most political violence over the last century, non-state actors, is done in the name of forward progress of some sort, Enlightenment ideals. But there's been a handful that have not. And I would include global jihad in that category, who are marked instead by these characteristics I mentioned earlier: nihilistic violence and apocalyptic anti-Enlightenment ideology. I introduced this concept of gnocicide, gnosis from the Greek meaning knowledge, the suffix side from the Latin meaning the killing of. So the killing of knowledge, or the killing of those with knowledge. And that has been an example or a characteristic of a number of, again, not a huge number, but a number of political movements over the last century that have been strike most people as very regressive, very anti-Enlightenment, sort of typically awful movements. Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Red Guards in China. Again, we can talk about any of those in particular if you'd like. Elements of the white nationalist movement today, I would also add as an example of a movement of rage that is marked by these two characteristics, which is fairly unusual. And global jihad as a variant because it's very much global. It's not, most of what I just mentioned were national groups, but here's an example at the global level. I think white nationalism also is, at least to some degree, a global variant as well. And again, all of these groups employing this notion of cultural contamination and gnocicide. So how do you clean up the cultural contamination through the attack on those people with knowledge? And with that, I will end it right there and turn it back over to Ayesha. And any of you want to buy the book, there it is at Stanford University Press, and you get a discount if you want, Robinson 20 for a 20% discount. So let me stop the screen share and over to you, Ayesha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. That was fascinating, and there was so much to unpack there. A really interesting evolution that you've laid out across a number of years that has shown sort of a movement that may have started on a very defensive sort of back foot, moving into much more of an offensive approach. Your discussion around state building, and then evolving towards a more systemic and systems-wide, position. A lot of fascinating things to discuss there. And I know that members of our Middle East study group are likely to have lots of questions. I would encourage them to put their questions using the Q&A function into Zoom. And of course, I'm happy to moderate and share their thoughts and questions with you. But I will take advantage of my position as moderator to launch the first question to you. And perhaps it's one that you can, sort of, you spoke to some of these factors, but I would like to just hear your thoughts a little bit further. You were speaking about how the global jihad movement isn't really unique, right? There isn't a whole lot there that you can't find in other iterations, Boko Haram, the Khmer Rouge, the more white nationalist movements. But is there anything that you have discovered is personally or very unique specifically to the global jihad movement? Anything in their tactics, the way that they've progressed, that is unique to this experience?
Sure. So, the way I would understand that is, by nature, I'm a comparativist. So in sort of big picture ways, there are not a lot of sui generis things out there. But kind of if you dig down, then you see at the more tactical level, let's say, that things that are unique in a way that you don't see quite the way that you see them here. So just to give you one example, Abdullah Azzam is the father of this notion of cult of martyrdom. If you look at Faraj's tract that I put up there from the late 70s in Egypt, he doesn't talk about martyrdom at all. This is just not an issue. He's not trying to recruit people to go kill themselves to be on a fast path to heaven, or have the 72 virgins and blah, blah, blah. This is not part of what the discourse was like in the 60s and 70s amongst jihadis. Azam, in part because he had the credentials. He was an alim. He was a cleric trained at Al-Azhar in Cairo. Very unusual, incidentally, for jihadi ideologues to have that kind of credentialing. He's the one that really laid out this intellectual architecture for the pursuit of martyrdom becoming absolutely critical in what jihadis do. And so you've seen this transformation in jihadi discourse, local and global, over the last 50 years or so, from one where this pursuit of martyrdom was a non-issue, to today where it's a central issue. And I would put most of the blame for that blame is normative, but anyway, at the feet of Abdullah Azam for really pushing this idea. So here's an example of something that is, you can see it getting constructed at a particular point in time. And it's pretty unique. It's pretty, you didn't see the Khmer Rouge or the Red Guards telling, their followers, or the white nationalists today telling their followers to go make sure you yourself go get killed in pursuit of this project.
Lovely. I will share a question that we've received from Gina Connor. Gina is asking, can you elaborate on your thoughts concerning the use and misuse of the term infidel, starting in the 80s by the media groups and others?
Wow, that's a big question. And first of all, are we dealing with the English or the Arabic? Because there's in English there's a lot of confusion, but in Arabic there's a lot of confusion too. If you look at the word murtad, for example, that's the word literally for apostate. But you also you see the word kafir, which is not apostate per se, but it's often used as a substitute for apostate. So there's a lot of sort of gray area, shall we say, even in the words, how these words are used in Arabic. In terms of how they're used in English and by the media, I guess I don't see, the word apostate is sometimes used, the heretic is often used, trying to encapsulate the view. In English, talking about heretic, if you're talking about the sectarian divide, in other words, Sunni jihadis critiquing the Rafidun, the rejectionists, the Shia, they will often, again, in the English version, use the word heretic for Shia and apostate for other people. But that's only when somebody really wants to be precise. And given the sort of willy-nilly looseness of the language, I think it's been used and misused in both languages quite a bit.
Thanks. Just picking up on that point around, semantics and the use of language. The jihad is clearly a Muslim religious imperative. There is a link to the religion there. But how much is this movement really disassociated from the religious aspects of Islam?
Yeah, and I get into absolutely 100% with you on that. And I get into that on page 1 in the book. And, again, where does the word come from? Jihad is just the noun form of the verb jahid, to literally to make an effort to do something, to strive or to be strenuous in your actions to achieve something noteworthy. The word is used in common day Arabic in religious and non-religious forms. People talk about, like if an American college student is talking about pulling an all-nighter to work hard to do well on some exam coming up. In Arabic, you might use that same thing, that you will jihad, you will make this effort, hard effort to accomplish something that's worthwhile. So it has both a religious and a non-religious notion. On the religious side, there's an old history of jihad as holy war, sort of religiously sanctioned violence. But there is a process by which a jihad can be called legitimately, and it can only be called by high-ranking a high-ranking member of the community. It can't just be called by you or me or anybody else just because we want to. So the point that I make, again, in the very first page of the book, is all the violence that I'm talking about in the course of the book that is under the banner of jihad has not been sanctioned by a legitimate authority. So all of it is illicit violence. Just by definition, it's illicit violence. So I try and make that clear just right up front in the book.
Sure. Thank you. I will follow up with a question that's in a little bit of a different direction, but of course, where I'm taking them as they come, and we'll keep that conversation flowing. But a question from Peter Larson. He's asking how much of the jihadi hatred of Israel in particular, as we references, comes from a theological dispute against Judaism, and how much from an anti-colonial impetus against Israel as an avant-garde force in the West for the Middle East.
Yes, both. One thing that I think is a fair statement, that in more sort of extremist Islamist and jihadi language, there is just a sort of old-fashioned anti-Semitism. I mean, that's a strand of what you read. I've seen the protocols of the Elders of Zion in Arabic for sale on the streets of Cairo, for example, and I'm not the only one. I mean, there's just a lot of Islamists, and not even just sort of the most extreme global jihadis, but there is an element of sort of just crass anti-Semitism in a lot of Islamist writings. But more broadly in the Muslim world, again, this is not just an Islamist or jihadi thing, but more broadly in the Muslim world, there is, and particularly in the Middle East, there is this view of Israel as being a sort of settler colonial state, outpost of Europe initially, and this sort of postmodern or modern depiction of it. So I think both elements play a role, but they play a role primarily with different communities within the Muslim world.
And connected, I would say, in part to your second wave around pushing out the Americans. I wonder whether there is now a connection to a new enemy in the state, in the form of the state of Israel. So, a question that we've got from Margaret Huber. She is an esteemed member of our board and has always the most fascinating questions. But she was saying, during this week of a so-called freedom convoy, as you're aware, in case you're not, Dr. Robinson, but there is a convoy of anti-vaccination truckers traveling from British Columbia on our west coast to Ottawa to protest against vaccination mandates being put in place by the government. But anyways, this convoy is headed our way here to Ottawa. They're traveling across Canada without the support of the National Truckers Union, most of course, who have been vaccinated, but calling for a variety of goals that include the reversal of vaccination mandates, national government change, and reportedly, Canada's own January 6th moment. And so I guess the question here from Margaret is, can you expand on white nationalist movements of rage in North America?
Yeah, and so particularly when you're talking about the most violent elements, I mean, they're sort of garden variety white nationalist bigots and racists that don't, ever do anything in support of violence. But if you look at, for example, the manifesto written by the Christchurch mosque killer that killed 51 Muslims in New Zealand a couple of years ago, or in Oslo a few years before then, the manifesto written by that killer. They very much lay out, I mean, this is most of you are familiar with this sort of great replacement theory, and that it is up to white Christian Australians, New Zealanders, Americans, Canadians, Europeans, etc., to defend, to violently expel this great replacement, the brown people that are coming to replace them. If you look at the the march with those silly tiki lamps. But anyway, the march in Charlottesville back in 2017, I believe it was.
A lifetime ago.
Yeah, I mean, what were they chanting? These guys with the tiki torches, white men, were all chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Right? Jews will not replace us. This refers to this, again, this notion of cosmopolitan Jews and their allies being responsible for the great replacement of bringing in, brown people from around the world, pushing out, the true American, white Americans, et cetera. The people that then take that to the violent stage, who therefore are, what are they doing? They're talking about cultural contamination that needs to be reversed, as sort of nocicide, if you will, and really kind of this climatic historical battle of some sort. That an anti-enlightenment, right? This is not reason-based and liberty and what have you. Once they take up arms and start killing in that name, then I think it fairly is called a movement of rage, like some of these other folks that we study.
Does your work explore at all the connection between these movements of rage and the use of social media and other tools of sort of digital propaganda? Certainly, I think, as we look at this anti-vax truck rally that's coming to Ottawa and other more recent movements, being able to leverage the internet and social media, all the newest forms of social media, has played a big part in the ability of these of these movements to be able to expand their reach.
I do, and I do this in the fourth wave. It's one of the things that makes the fourth wave distinctive from other waves. And I coined this phrase, Wiki Narrative, which is, again, I think it's a very interesting way to think about it, is if you look at other ideological movements, there are typically 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 individuals that are primarily responsible for the ideological construction of the movement. Well, if you assassinate those 3 or 4 or 5 people, let's say global jihadi ideologues, not much is left in terms of the ideological construction. So what Abu Musab al-Suri and others he was hinting at, and what others have sort of developed, is, again, what I call this wiki narrative. So it's a narrative of global jihad. It's not dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people. It is dependent on a group, on hundreds or thousands of people who will, morph and tune and change, and it's kind of within certain parameters, a malleable construction and reconstruction and re-reconstruction of the ideology all the time, based on on sort of what current events, what new attack has happened, to incorporate that, to stitch that into this greater narrative. Abu Musab al-Suri used the word thaqafa, which just means culture in Arabic. He's really talking about a narrative, and he's really talking about a group narrative that is ever evolving, ever changing. How does that group narrative evolve and change and get out? It's through modern information technology, social media, internet, etc.
Fascinating. A question from Harry Lee. He's asking, the Taliban formed a government in Afghanistan last September after the Allies' military and diplomatic withdrawal. Can you speak on the past 5 months of the new government in terms of their domestic policy, as well as their diplomatic engagement with Russia and China? What kind of re-engagement initiatives do you foresee with the US and Canada?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $64,000 question, or at least a form of the $64,000 question, which is, will the Taliban revert to its former policy in the 1990s of harboring bad actors, in that case, harboring Al-Qaeda? Have they learned the lesson that there's lots they can do, lots of horrible things they can do that are on population, but as long as they don't cross that line, they're going to stay in power. You're not going to have a NATO-led invasion to overthrow them again. If they cross that line, and once again allow really bad actors to organize and train and to attack other states, there's going to be some problems. Now, you can bet that Canadian and American and other intelligence services are looking at this question intently every day to see what evidence there is. My own read of the situation up to this point is that the Taliban have, they have familial relations with some Al-Qaeda folks and this and that. So on a personal level, there may be individual actors in Afghanistan, but they have not allowed sort of group formation and training and camps and all that kind of stuff that they did in the 1990s, at least not yet. Now, part of the problem is they don't really control a lot of Afghanistan, and I think they'll control less and less of it as time goes on. So, ungoverned spaces tends to create problems. Finally, one of the things that has been reported is the Taliban working with the Chinese intelligence to try and prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening. How to go after particularly the so-called ISIS Khorasan, which the Taliban have engaged in armed fights with. So how to more effectively get rid of these kinds of folks. So, I mean, so much is happening in Afghanistan with the Taliban, the dire financial situation of the country, the potentially looming humanitarian disaster, the Taliban reaching out to some actors, again, like the Chinese, to try and help them. Will they reach out, and will that be met in the future by the Americans, the Canadians? I don't know. That may be a bridge too far in the near term, but don't forget, the Taliban and the Americans worked pretty closely together in those final days of the American presence in Afghanistan. So it's not beyond the pale.
I'm going to come back to some questions, sort of tackling, some of the underlying issues of this movement, with a question from Tag El-Khazin, and he posits that Islam and liberalism will never meet. He is arguing that the ayat al-Saif of the sword in the Surat al-Tawbah is detrimental. It does call for unlimited vengeance against the infidels, and so linking to this. Fundamentalists, he argues, are not working in a void. How would you see such strong fundamental anchors addressed if we look forward?
Yeah, so Ayat al-Saif is the sword verse, and it is, as Tag represents it, it is a sort of a nasty call to hunt down the infidels. The word that gets used, incidentally, there is not actually infidel. It most likely refers to the polytheists that the Muslim forces were fighting at the time, and then once the essentially Ramadan ends and you go back to fighting them, you can just there are no limits there. So there are two responses that kind of mainstream Muslims make. One is that interpretation of the sword verse misunderstands the context in which it was written, again, having to do particularly with the polytheists that were engaged in battle at the time in the 7th century. And it's been superseded by far more verses about how to relate to others, to non-Muslims, etc. But for people that are, we'll back up a little bit. I like to use this phrase cultural toolbox, right? That any big tradition, whether Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or whatever, any big tradition has a very large cultural toolbox, and you can take out different tools and build different ideologies depending on the tools that you take out. So if you're looking to build an ideology out of Islam that is violent and sort of always violent against, you either believe what I believe or I'll kill you, you can find stuff, and at the top of the list is the Ayat al-Saif, the sword verse. But you can also find lots of other stuff that's contradictory to it. And then, at least what I would tend to do is defer to the experts, to the scholars that study this, as to kind of what is the most appropriate interpretation of this or that. So Tag is absolutely right that this has been commonly quoted by jihadis of all stripes. But it's not kind of the last word on the subject either.
Perfect. A question from another question from Peter Larson, a really great one. He says, great presentation, and so I'll pass along his praise to you. Absolutely. And commends you on the evolution, on your description of the evolution of these 4 phases. His question is, was this evolution internally driven, or was it in response to evolution in the situation? The USSR is out, the USA, excuse me, is in, Arabs are being aborted, et cetera, et cetera. So how much of this is a response to other movements and external factors?
Yeah, and there's no question that so my view, or the way I treat it, is looking from within, and then looking at external factors through the eyes of the people that I'm studying as best I can. But there's no question that external, primarily superpower actions had a pretty major role in launching each of these waves. The first wave is launched very much in response to the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. The second wave is launched not quite as kind of a one-to-one correspondence, but certainly within the context of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 1991 and the sanctions regime and stuff that followed. That helped push forward the second wave. The ISIS wave, very much a byproduct of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Without that, and of course the Syrian civil war, so that's another external factor. But the U.S. invasion played a major role in launching ISIS eventually. And the fourth wave is linked again in its origin to the not just U.S. but including Canada and coalition partners going into Afghanistan in 2001 in response to the 9/11 terror attack. So there's no question. I mean, Peter's absolutely right. There's no question that these kind of external great power actions played a major role in launching each of these waves. I think the story is a lot more complicated in terms of the internal progression, how things were viewed, acted upon, et cetera. But yeah, they didn't live in a vacuum, and neither do we.
Thank you so much. I realize that we've come right upon 6 o'clock, and so I will take an opportunity to do a last check to see if folks have questions. There is one in the chat, which I apologize. I might mangle this. If I do, the author can certainly feel free to reach out to me. But he's E. Craig Wilson asking you to assess sort of 2 areas where support for jihad is less strong. He's spoken about cultural, demographic, economic differences, and the rise, how that's impacting sort of support for jihad. He's giving the example of some ex-Soviet republics, mostly Turkic languages, where support seems to have grown, until about 2020, 2021. And of course, there was crackdowns in Afghanistan and China. Do you think support for those movements is still on the wane, or are there extenuating factors that will see that grow? And his second point is around Southeast Asia, and commenting on Malaysia and Indonesia, where there is a less militant brand, perhaps, of these movements. And so his suggestion is that economic prosperity can attenuate some of these militant tendencies. How would you respond to that?
Absolutely right. For my money, probably the least Islamist place ever was Bosnia before the Serbian caused wars of the 1990s. There was essentially no Islamist movement, certainly no jihadi movement. It was a very secular kind of place. And I think you find that here and there. And so I sort of the general rule is, in my mind, one is wealth helps, right? Wealth helps everything. And, whatever the problem is, wealth helps attenuate it. It doesn't necessarily cure it, but it certainly helps, provides potentially the resources for it. As a general matter, as I look to the future, I would say that, again, making that distinction I made up front between Islamism and jihadism, while there's definitely some overlap, there's some significant distinctions as well. Primarily over the issue of violence. I see no reason to believe that Islamism as a political movement, a socio-political movement, is going to go away. I think it's, it'll be stronger in some countries and weaker in other countries. But at least as we look out today, it appeals to enough people, 20, 25% in Muslim majority countries, something like that. And again, that will vary from place to place and over time. But the appeal of Islamism I see is very durable. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. Jihadism, I think, has been significantly weakened. You see ISIS, by far the most successful global jihad group that involved perhaps 40,000 fighters. It was a big deal. It was a big movement, which has been defeated as a state, but not as a movement yet. But I think if one is trying to take the sort of the long view, that in general, the jihad phenomenon is weakening, I think. But I see no reason to make that same statement when it comes to Islamism.
And perfect. And perhaps I think that's a scary, but a good place for us to close out tonight. If there is no, you're not seeing a change in the future, perhaps, I might ask a final question about what is to come. Are there ways for us to tackle these, these kinds of movements? I'm thinking specifically with a development lens in my mind. Your point earlier around wealth helping to solve problems. What should we be thinking about in terms of an approach to addressing this kind of phenomenon?
Yeah, and that's again it's a very complicated, multifaceted issue. One issue has to do with sovereignty, right? That people need to be allowed to control their own futures. So that weakens the hand of outsiders to sort of direct traffic in a certain way. It also, and here I think from a policy perspective, becomes important. If one accepts that sort of general distinction and formulation I made of Islamism and jihadism, having self-interested regimes in Egypt and elsewhere try and conflate the two. They're all terrorists, right? They're all violence prone. And this is simply not true. And it, in my mind, makes things more difficult, makes things harder going forward. It forces, in this, just use the case of Egypt, it forces Egyptians to essentially make a choice that they wouldn't have to make if they could just participate, vote for the Muslim Brotherhood or some other, Hizb ut-Nur or the Nur party or other parties in elections, as they did in 2012, for example. If they could just do that, that would suffice. Their yearning to live in some version of a modern but Islamic state. Forcing them to choose, saying, you basically have to take up arms to defend this choice because you're not allowed to do it in the mainstream. I think it's a very dangerous precedent. And I think, for example, the Sisi coup in Egypt and the regime who has made that argument constantly, that there's no difference between Islamists and jihadis, they're all terrorists, et cetera, is not just dangerous for Egypt, but I think it's dangerous for outside actors, including North Americans as well. So I think that as a policy thing, being aware of that tendency of self-interested regimes trying to make that argument when it's simply not a true argument can be very problematic and needs to be pushed back upon.
There you go, a path forward that hopefully we can adopt, especially in our approach here in Canada. I will take a moment just to say thank you so much, Dr. Robinson, for sharing your expertise with the members of the National Capital Branch's Middle East Study Group. This has been a fascinating discussion, clearly demonstrated by the nature of questions that folks have put to you today. We want to thank you for making the time for us today. In my role as president of this branch, I would like to say, I think this is a great launching pad for discussions of this Middle East Study Group. And so a big congratulations to Hamid and to Reed for organizing this panel today and for attracting such a distinguished and acclaimed guest for our first session today. To the broader audience, thank you for your very fascinating questions, for your thoughtful interventions, lots of expertise around the table. I hope this was instructive and informative for you as well. I will plug very quickly the Canadian International Council and the National Capital Branch. If you liked what you heard today, if you are not already a member of the CIC, please take some time to do so and support other future activities like this. And so you can reach out to me, you can reach out to Hamid, you can reach out to Reed, but do get involved and help facilitate further conversations like the one we've had tonight. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Robinson. That was a really fascinating intervention. And I will pass it back to Hamid to close us out for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayesha.
Thank you, Ayesha. Well said. And again, I don't want to repeat the same thing that you said in terms of our great thanks to you and audience. Our audience, we need their support, and I would like to encourage those who have not been a member, consider becoming a member of CIC and enable us to provide you with these programs. I was very impressed with your presentation and the manner in which you answered some of the questions, Professor Robinson, especially when you were referring to that toolbox and the history of the radical events, because if you go back to some of the books, you see that, for example, in the book of Samuel, there is a specific suggestion for a genocide, but again, it's how people use it. And one of the best examples about the radicalization of religious movements is East India Company. They used to use that toolbox in order to advance their interest in India, in the Indian subcontinent, and it's well recorded. Overall, I think it was a very good intellectual debate, and you provided us with all the elements of the topic. And I encourage people to consider buying your book, because obviously you have done a great deal of research in putting the ideas together. Once again, thanks to our audience, thanks to you, Professor Robinson, thanks to Madame Malette, our president, and also to Reed, who is our champion. He is a graduate student. He's working and he's having a young family, but yet he finds time to help us with our technical requirements for putting these programs together. So thank you, everyone. And once again, thanks to our audience and our distinguished guest.
Thank you.